And I'm going to talk primarily about data from the United States, where our team focuses, but the lessons that I think we extract from these data will be relevant to Canada and I think countries around the world. And I will show some data specifically for Canada that we put together for this talk at the very end before we get to questions. So I'm going to talk about how we can use modern data and scientific analysis to improve equality of opportunity, opportunities to rise up in our local communities. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the idea of the American dream, which is, of course, a central aspect of the American identity, the idea that through hard work, America is supposed to be a country where any child has the chance of rising up in the income distribution relative to their parents. And I want to start in this first chart here by assessing the extent to which that's actually true. So in a study my colleagues and I did a few years ago, we measured a very simple notion of the American dream. What fraction of kids go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s. And we look at that data by the year in which the child is born. Starting on the far left, here with children born in the middle of the last century, back in the 1940s and 1950s, and looking all the way, if you go over to the right, to kids born in the 1980s who are turning 30 in recent years when we're measuring their earnings. So if you look at this chart, you can see that for the children born in the middle of the last century, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of kids who were born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you see a dramatic fading of the American dream. That is, for kids born in the middle of the 1980s, entering the labor market now, it's become a 50-50 chance, essentially a coin flip, as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. Now, I'm showing you this data here for the United States. I'm going to show you the data at the end, analogous data for Canada that other researchers have constructed. And you might think to yourselves in the meantime, do you think the same pattern is playing out in Canada? If so, why or why not? But in the United States, this is a very clear and important phenomenon. It's, of course, a phenomenon of great interest to economists like myself, because it reflects a fundamental change in what the US economy looks like. I would argue it's also a fundamental social and political interest, because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the US are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead. And I think that's reflected in a lot of recent political outcomes and so forth. So in our research and policy group here at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we are focused on the big picture question of what is driving that trend of the fading American dream, and how can we restore the American dream going forward, creating better opportunities for all to rise up. Now that question of how we can improve equality of opportunity, reduce inequality, is, of course, we're not the first to study those issues. We're not the first to ask that question. What is our angle on it? We use big data to study how to increase upward mobility. Now, you all hear a lot these days about big data in the context of the private sector. Major companies like Amazon and Google using large data sets to improve the products they offer. Analogously, our vision is that those types of data can be used to answer critical social and economic policy questions like how can we improve equality of opportunity. Now, in analyzing these vast troves of data that I'm going to tell you about in a second, you need to have some way that you're going to organize the data and study the problem. Often what people choose to do is focus on one set of interventions. Like you might think about concentrating on education as a potential pathway to upward mobility. And I'm going to talk a little bit about education, but I'm also going to talk about housing policy, social capital, a variety of different issues, because we see in our data, the analysis I'm going to share with you, that it seems like a variety of different factors really matter for determining inequality and opportunity. And instead, we are going to organize our analysis from a life course perspective, looking at things from birth to adulthood, thinking about how different interventions at different points when kids are growing up might impact their life outcomes. The starting point for a lot of our analysis is that there are very sharp local differences in rates of upward mobility. So that national picture I showed you of the fading American dream, the story actually differs greatly across different parts of the United States. So to show you that, let me turn to this map here, which illustrates the geography of upward mobility in the United States. Let me first describe how we construct this map, and then I'll talk about what I think we learned from it. So what we did here is took data on 20 million kids, essentially all kids born in the United States in the early 1980s, and used information from anonymized tax returns to link them to their parents so that we could measure upward mobility in a very precise way for kids growing up in different parts of the United States. We mapped each of those 20 million kids back to the area of the US where they were born, dividing the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculated a simple measure of upward mobility. What is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families, that is, families making about $27,000 a year, which puts them at the 25th percentile of the US national income distribution. We color the map so that red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility, and blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. Now, if you just look first at the scale on the lower right-hand side of this map, you can see that there's an enormous range of variation in children's chances of rising up, even for kids born in the 1980s who are turning 30 around now. For kids born, for instance, in the center of the country, a place like Dubuque, Iowa, for example, kids born to families making $27,000 a year, one generation later, on average, are making more than $45,000 a year. So a substantial amount of upward mobility across one generation. But in contrast, if you look at kids growing up in families at the exact same income level in Charlotte, North Carolina, you see that their average incomes are only $26,000 a year, actually lower than where their parents were one generation earlier, despite the fact that there's been an enormous amount of economic growth in the United States, and in Charlotte in particular, over the past 30 years. So a clear illustration of the lack of inclusive growth in Charlotte, where lots of people are being left behind despite the growth in the economy. Now, you can see the broad regional patterns for yourself. Much of the center of the country, the rural Midwest in the US, has very high rates of upward mobility. Much of the Southeast and the industrial Midwest, places like Detroit and Cleveland, have very low rates of upward mobility. Parts of the coast have higher rates of upward mobility. When we look at this variation, we find it to be of great interest both from a scientific and a policy perspective. From a scientific perspective, we'd like to understand why places like Salt Lake City or Dubuque, Iowa have much higher rates of upward mobility than Detroit or Cleveland, because that may give us clues into what the drivers of differences in upward mobility are across places. From a policy perspective, if we can figure out the answers to those questions, maybe we can then devise policies to improve upward mobility in the red-colored parts of the map, thereby improving equality of opportunity for everyone. So motivated by those questions, the way I'm going to structure the conversation in the next few minutes is basically to go through a series of potential explanations for what might be driving the variation in this map and ask from a scientific point of view, what is it that's driving these differences in rates of upward mobility, and what implications does that have for how we should be trying to increase equality of opportunity in the United States and beyond. Now, you probably already have some explanations in your own mind for what might be driving this variation across areas. One hypothesis that often comes to people's minds, especially economists, is that maybe this is about differences in the types of jobs that are available in different places. To pick one example, the Bay Area, which looks pretty good in terms of children's chances of rising up, of course, has had a boom in recent decades with Silicon Valley and the tech sector. And maybe that kind of thing, if you're living around fast-growing tech jobs, maybe that benefits you. So to evaluate that hypothesis, I'm going to turn to this chart here, which plots the rates of upward mobility that I was showing you on the previous map for kids who grow up in low-income families in the 30 largest cities in the US here, against job growth rates from 1990 to 2010, the period over which kids in this sample were growing up. And what you can see if you look at this chart is that there's basically no relationship between these two variables. In particular, you have cities like Charlotte, which I mentioned before, and Atlanta, which by any standard measure of job growth or wage growth, anybody familiar with the US would think of those as booming cities. If you were to just drive around those cities, you would see that Charlotte looks incredibly prosperous now in a way that it didn't 25, 30 years ago. But when you look at our data from a longitudinal perspective, look at the kids who were growing up in Charlotte in low-income families, you see that despite that job growth, Charlotte actually has one of the lowest rates of upward mobility for low-income kids growing up there in the US. And so you might ask first, just like from an arithmetic perspective, how does that add up? How can Charlotte both be one of the most rapidly growing cities when you look at how things have evolved over time, yet the people who live there, the kids who grow up in low-income families there, are not doing any better. So the way I think about it is that Charlotte and Atlanta essentially import a lot of talent. Lots of people grow up in other cities and move to Charlotte and Atlanta to get high-paying jobs at places like Bank of America, which is headquartered in Charlotte. But apparently what we're learning from these data is that the low-income kids who grow up in Charlotte themselves don't benefit from that economic growth. So the first very simple lesson here, which I think is related to earlier conversations you've had, is that economic growth in general is not by itself a guarantee of inclusive growth. Simply bringing more jobs to your area, trying to attract the Amazon headquarters to your city or another big business to your city, is by no means a guarantee that people in lower income families, middle class families in your city are going to do better. I think what we learned from this is we need to take deliberate measures to try to improve the skill level and the human capital of people growing up in some of these areas with low levels of upward mobility to equip them to get those higher paying jobs. Obviously, jobs matter on the grand scale. If people don't have jobs, they can't have higher levels of income. But we need to be very deliberate about how we provide people the skills to get those higher paying jobs. So that was explanation number one. Is it about differences in job growth across areas? And the answer really seems like that's not what it is. So let me now come back to the map again and talk about a second potential explanation that's very salient here in the US, especially at present, which is that this might be about racial disparities. So anyone familiar with the demographics of the US would recognize that there's a potential connection to race here, in particular the areas with larger Black populations. Cities like Detroit, much of the Southeast, tend to be in the red and orange colors on the map. Now, we all know that there's a long history of racial disparities in the US and elsewhere, and so it might not come as any surprise that Black Americans have lower rates of upward mobility than white Americans, and perhaps what we're seeing on this map, given how racially segregated the US is not differences across places as much as it is differences across races. Now, to get at that, in a subsequent study, what we did is replicated the map that I just showed you, but separately for Black men on the left and white men on the right. And you'll see in a second why I'm focusing on men separately from women here. Now, if you look at these two maps, initially your reaction might be that it looks like we put these two maps on two different color scales, kind of a red-orange color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that in fact we have not. The maps are on the same color scale. It's just that there is such an extreme difference in rates of upward mobility for Black men and white men in the US that it looks like you're in two different countries. The very best places in terms of upward mobility for Black men, a place like Boston, for example, where Black man growing up in a low-income family goes on to have earnings of about $25,000 a year, you see lower levels of upward mobility in Boston for Black men than the very worst places for upward mobility for white men, like Charlotte, North Carolina. So it's like two non-overlapping countries, basically, in terms of economic opportunity. So what that tells you is there is indeed no overstating the importance of race. Race is crucial in determining economic opportunity, even conditional on class. So we need to think hard about how to address those racial disparities. That being said, even among white men, there's quite substantial variation in rates of economic mobility across areas. So my reading of this is that race matters, but place matters as well. Now, I just showed you this data for Black versus white men. I now want to show you the same pair of maps for Black versus white women. And here you see a very different pattern. The spectrum of colors you see on the map on the left is the same as the spectrum of colors that you see on the map on the right. And more broadly, we find very little difference in rates of economic mobility between Black and white women. Now, this is useful to understand because it suggests that racial disparities are not emerging in a common way across men and women. They emerge specifically from differences in mobility among Black versus white men, and that might lead you to think about certain factors like criminal justice or other issues related to discrimination that might adversely affect Black men in particular. So what we've done so far is looked at broad variation across different cities, across different regions, that gives us some insight into what might be driving these differences in economic mobility across areas. What I want to do next is zoom in to an even finer level of geography. And in order to do that, I'm going to toggle over to this tool called the Opportunity Atlas, which is an interactive website that our team has built, which you can freely access yourself if you're interested. And the way this works is very much like a Google map. You can type in any address you like. I'm just going to put in New York here. And you can literally zoom in to look at economic opportunity, neighborhood by neighborhood, within any city in America. And so here, zooming in to New York City, you can see Central Park here, Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, and so forth. You can see that there are remarkable differences in economic opportunity across areas that are within a couple of miles of each other within New York City. So if you look at the spectrum of colors that you're seeing on the screen here, it is exactly the same spectrum of colors that I was showing you on the national map to begin with. That is, you can go from the darkest reds over here in the Bronx to the deepest blues here in Queens, just crossing the bridge or just going a few miles down the street here to Manhattan. Now, what is that telling you? It's like you can go from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility, even within a given city across very nearby neighborhoods. Why is that important? It shows us that the roots of differences in economic opportunity are not coming from broad differences in policy across states or across regions. No, they're actually coming from differences in outcomes across kids living on different sides of the same street in many cases. So there's a hyper-local origin of differences in rates of economic mobility. Now, naturally, the next question is, what is it that's making parts of Queens have much higher rates of economic mobility than other parts of Brooklyn or the Bronx? And so to look at this, we've done a series of studies, which I'm just not going to show you and just briefly summarize here in the interest of time, which establish that the key factor that's leading to these differences is where kids grow up rather than where you live as an adult. If you do an experiment where you randomly give children housing vouchers to move to some of these blue-colored areas on the map, you see that kids who make those moves, particularly at young ages, end up doing dramatically better as adults. They have much higher rates of upward mobility, higher levels of education, better health outcomes, and so forth, relative to kids who stay in more of the red-colored parts of the map. So there's very clear evidence that where you grow up has causal effects on long-term outcomes, driven by childhood development. So the natural next question you might be wondering about, coming back to the slides here, is what is it that's driving these differences in rates of upward mobility across these nearby neighborhoods? What is leading kids through the childhood development process to do better in some parts of New York than others? So to get at that, I'm going to show you what we found to be the 4 strongest predictors of differences in economic mobility across areas. We've looked at a variety of different factors, and just in a predictive sense, in a correlational sense, we found these 4 factors to be the strongest predictors of differences in economic mobility. So just to read them off, first, places that have higher levels of upward mobility tend to have lower poverty rates. They tend to be mixed income neighborhoods rather than highly segregated neighborhoods. So residential integration seems to be strongly associated with better outcomes for the poor, but somewhat interestingly, not worse outcomes for the rich. More mixed income neighborhoods improve upward mobility for low income kids, but don't seem to be particularly detrimental for high income kids. Second, we find that places with more stable family structures, that is more 2-parent families in particular, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Third, we find that places with better schools, measured in various ways, smaller class sizes, better teachers, and so forth, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility, as you might expect intuitively. And finally, we find that places with greater social capital, in particular more connections between people from different backgrounds, low-income people being connected to high-income people, for instance, this turns out to be a really strong predictor of economic mobility, is one of the key areas that we're focusing on as a team in our current research. So what you can see from these 4 factors is not so much a recipe for exactly how you increase economic mobility in a given area. I think more work needs to be done to figure that out. But rather, what this shows you is that there's a variety of different things that matter. It's not just about schools. It's not just about poverty rates and residential integration. We also have to think about things like social capital and networks and things like that. So it's a multifaceted problem that seems to matter. What I view as encouraging about that is that regardless of your perspective on which area you're focused in, there are often ways that you can intervene in terms of improving the quality of education or trying to create more social capital that can improve outcomes. So that's a natural segue to the final set of points I want to make on what can we actually do to increase economic mobility in light of the data that I've been showing you here. So the way I think about it is that the research base that I've just shared with you points to three different types of approaches, three different types of policy approaches to improve economic mobility going forward. To summarize in a nutshell, what I think we learned from research over the past 10 years or so using big data is that the roots of economic opportunity are hyperlocal. Where you're growing up within something like a half-mile radius of your house, the conditions there really seem to matter. And what's really crucial is where you're growing up from birth till something like age 20 or 22, and not so much where you live after that point. So if you have that worldview, I think you would think about three different ways of trying to increase economic mobility. The first is to reduce segregation. If I can see that down the street in New York, I see much better opportunities for low-income kids, a very simple thing I might think about doing is try to help more low-income families who want to move to some of these higher opportunity areas where we know now from rigorous research that we will see better outcomes for their kids. So that's one approach, sort of a moving to opportunity approach. A second approach is recognizing that you can't possibly move everyone, and not everyone wants to move anyway. We need to figure out how to bring opportunity to people rather than bringing people to opportunity. How can we make strategic place-based investments to increase upward mobility in low opportunity areas? The third pillar that we're focused on our team is improving higher education. The logic there is that after age 18, the key touch point for most kids is not where they're growing up, but rather where they're going to college. And I think there are ways that we can use modern data to amplify the impacts of the higher education system on upward mobility as well. So let me spend a couple of minutes talking about each of these points and then wrap up. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach. So I want to come back here to the opportunity atlas data that I was showing you and show you here an example from Seattle, where we see that same kind of variation that we saw in New York City, with some parts of Seattle in the center of the city having much lower rates of economic mobility than other parts of the city. Now, what I've done here is overlaid with the bright green dots the most common places where families receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live in Seattle. So in the US, we spend about $45 billion a year on affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are housing vouchers that give about 2.5 million families rental assistance to rent housing wherever they would like, worth about $1,500 a month in Seattle, with the intention of giving families to better neighborhoods, to neighborhoods where their kids might do better in the long run. It's one of the goals of the program. Now, what we noticed when we put out these data a couple of years ago is that if you look at where voucher holders currently live, despite the fact that they're getting $1,500 a month of rental assistance from the government, they are still concentrated in relatively low opportunity parts of the city. They're concentrated in the red and orange colored neighborhoods rather than the blue-green colored neighborhoods, as you can see here. That's a pattern that holds in Seattle, it's a pattern that holds in Chicago, it's a pattern that holds across the United States. Now, we began to wonder, why is that the case? What this means is that despite spending billions of dollars on these programs, we're not actually breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty. And is that because these families don't want to move to some of these blue-green colored parts of Seattle, maybe because they want to stay close to their family or their job or things like that? Or is it because there are other barriers that are preventing them from moving to these higher opportunity areas? And so what we did in collaboration with the local housing authorities, the Seattle and King County housing authorities, is designed a randomized pilot study called Creating Moves to Opportunity that tested whether trying to reduce some of these barriers to moving to opportunity by giving families help in moving to high opportunity neighborhoods could make a difference in where they chose to live. So what this program did is essentially took 1,000 families who came to apply for a housing voucher through the standard protocol, split them into two groups, randomly selected 500 of them, and gave them additional assistance in the housing search process, a counselor who would help you find housing in a high opportunity neighborhood, connect you with landlords, simplify the process of renting, and give you a little bit of financial assistance to pay a security deposit or other kinds of resources to make the move if you wanted to make the move. We designed this as a randomized study so we can simply compare the outcomes in the control group that did not receive those additional services and the treatment group that did. And what we're looking at here is the fraction of households that chose to move to a high opportunity area, to a blue-green colored area on the map that I was just showing you, versus a red-orange colored area. And what you can see is that number jumps from 14% in the control group to 54% in the treatment group. So many more families that got these additional services are now living in neighborhoods where we know from prior work their kids are going to have much better outcomes in the long run. We estimate that the average child growing up in the high opportunity areas to which families in the treatment group moved will earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes relative to kids in the control group, as a result of this simple intervention that cost about $2,500 a year. Sorry, it cost about $2,500 total to provide this assistance. So what this shows is that we can leverage, in this case, existing programs to try to desegregate cities in the US and provide a little bit of end-line assistance to make those programs more effective and use modern data to greatly amplify the impacts of these programs on increasing upward mobility by giving low-income families access to better neighborhoods. So that is one approach that I think clearly can work, and indeed is now being scaled across the United States, with Congress authorizing substantial funding to replicate what we did in Seattle and cities across the country, and a support for a proposal to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year to make many more families eligible for an enhanced version of this program that actually has the social support to help families achieve the outcomes that we're aiming for. So that's one approach, moving to opportunity. Let me touch briefly on these other two approaches before opening it up to questions. So as I said, moving to opportunity, I think reducing segregation is one tool in the toolkit, but it's clearly not the only approach that one should take. It's not fully scalable. So in parallel, we're working hard to try to understand what types of investments one can make in specific places to improve economic opportunities in the red-colored parts of the map. That can range from things like early childhood programs that give kids access to better preschools or better school environments, to programs that invest in increasing social capital, creating better mentoring, to targeted job training programs that have been shown in highly effective randomized trials to increase earnings substantially, especially when individuals are paired with employers who are looking for specific skills that these programs train them for. So I think there are a number of approaches that can be taken to place-based investment that can be quite effective. I think there's more work to be done to determine exactly which types of programs are most effective, but that continues to be an area of focus. Finally, let me say a brief word about improving higher education, which I think is also an area with great potential to amplify impacts on upward mobility and inclusive growth. And I'll show one slide on that, which gives you a sense of the type of work one can do there. So in parallel to the statistics that we've constructed on economic mobility for every neighborhood in the United States, we've also constructed similar statistics for every college in America, using information from tax returns, looking at 30 million students across colleges in the US, to look at how well students do and the impacts of colleges on upward mobility. So to understand the impacts of colleges on upward mobility, it's useful to look at two different dimensions: a measure of success, the fraction of kids from low-income families, the bottom 20%, who end up rising up to the top 20% of the income distribution. So if you look, for instance, at places like Princeton and Harvard, some of the most selective colleges in the US, perhaps not surprisingly, the very talented students who attend those colleges tend to do extremely well. Low-income kids who attend those colleges have fantastic outcomes. The problem, though, is what matters for a college's contribution for economic mobility is not just how well its low-income students do, but how many low-income students are attending those colleges to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis, the fraction of kids at each of these colleges that are coming from low-income families, from families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And you can see that at places like Princeton and Harvard, those numbers are extremely small. Less than 3% of kids are coming from families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution. So as a result, those colleges actually do not contribute a great deal to economic mobility, not because they don't have good outcomes, but simply because they don't cater to low and middle income kids. And so in order to have high levels of economic mobility, you need to sort of be in the upper right side of this chart. You need to be a college that both serves a lot of low income kids and propels them to have pretty good outcomes. Now, what you can see is, unfortunately, in the US at present, we basically have a strong downward sloping relationship here with very few colleges that are up here in the upper right side. There are a few exceptions, places like the City University of New York, other kind of mid-tier public institutions that cater to a lot of low-income kids and have pretty good outcomes and serve as escalators for upward mobility. But I think a key challenge going forward in the US, and I suspect Canada as well, is to figure out how you make the highly successful colleges more accessible to low-income kids. So we're working with colleges like Harvard to understand how we might shift this dock to the right. And conversely, how you might shift the outcomes at many community colleges, for instance, that serve a lot of low-income kids. How do you improve outcomes for low-income kids at those colleges? So that's another dimension on which I think this type of modern data can permit granular intervention that can improve outcomes and upward mobility significantly. So let me end by talking about a couple of implications for Canada. I've been showing you data from the United States. So how much does all of this translate to Canada? So I spent a bit of time looking at parallel research that's been done in Canada. And initially, I think my hypothesis was that things might look fairly different in Canada relative to the United States. But it turns out the data paint a more nuanced story. So let's come back to this chart that I showed you at the beginning of the fading American dream and ask, is there also a fading Canadian dream? Or what do kids' chances of rising up in Canada or other countries look like over time? And so here's an analysis done by Robert Menduca and co-authors that replicates what we did in the United States in the dashed gray line here, where you see that decline that I showed you before. And now does the same thing in a variety of other countries. Now in Canada, you happen to have more limited data to do this at present. But the thing that struck me is that children's chances of rising up and doing better than their parents for recent cohorts in Canada, people around age 30, 35 today, are actually no different in Canada than in the US. About 55% of kids are doing better than their parents in Canada in recent cohorts, very similar to where we are in the United States, according to the study, and drastically lower than in many Scandinavian countries that are famous for having greater equality of opportunity and more inclusive growth. So in that respect, Canada looks a lot like the US. You might also wonder the extent to which there's regional variation in Canada, variation across areas. And here's an interesting study done that replicates what we did in the US and Canada by Miles Korak, which measures upward mobility across census divisions in Canada and looks at the fraction of kids who rise to the top fifth of the national income distribution, conditional on having parents in the bottom fifth, and adopts that same color scheme with green and lighter yellow colors representing areas with higher levels of upward mobility, red representing areas with lower levels of upward mobility. Now, I know nothing about the geography of Canada, so I'll leave it to you all to interpret this map. But what struck me is that there's quite a bit of variation in Canada as well in terms of rates of upward mobility. It's in that respect also, I think, somewhat similar to the United States. And so my suspicion is a lot of the lessons that I've shared with you on the drivers of upward mobility in the US are likely to translate to the Canadian context as well. And I think the key message to take away is that with modern data and with careful analysis of which communities have the biggest challenges and targeted interventions, focusing on improving childhood development in those places, we can potentially create better opportunities for all going forward. So let me stop there. If you're interested in reading more about these studies or looking at the data yourself, here are some links and information that could be helpful. Thanks very much.